Thank you, Mr. Ranking Member, for that question. It would be very difficult to predict or to read the mind of Vladimir Putin, but I can say that it seems to us that the efforts most recently in the Balkans by Russia tend to be aimed at increasing influence of Russia, tend to be to discourage the countries of the Western Balkans from advancing towards the West. Western institutions, whether it's European Union or NATO, tends to be to, as much as possible, create greater dependency of these countries on Russia as opposed to on the West. So there does not, in my view, appear to be a kind of grand strategy, rather an opportunistic approach at how to weaken certain governments that may be favorably disposed towards the West, to help governments become, if possible, more dependent or more friendly towards Russia. And of course, there's a commercial motivation behind a lot of what Russia does as well, to, for example, in the energy area, to increase the dependence of Europe and including the Balkans on Russian sources of hydrocarbons.
Thank you. Well, let me ask the opposite question, too. We have a new administration here in the United States. So what would you say is, in our engagement, what's new in the United States engagement? Is it something new? Is it the same as in the past administration? Are there any differences or any changes in our goals? That's why I'm delighted to have you here, because we're trying to figure that out. And unless we have individuals like yourself, we don't have anyone to ask. So I'm trying to figure out what are our goals, or the administration's goals, and whether they've changed, if they're different. If they're different from the prior administration, what are they? And please, give me an answer to that.
Thank you, Mr. Meeks, for that question. U.S. policy in the Balkans, for good reason, I believe, has been consistent over the last several administrations, going back at least the last 2 decades, where I believe all of the administrations, the United States administrations, have focused on protecting and advancing U.S. interests in the Balkans, a very volatile area, an area where there has been considerable instability. Our interests are supported by the sorts of efforts that you mentioned, sir, in your opening statement, as well as the chairman, that it is very important for the United States that the region be peaceful, it be secure, it be stable, that elements, sources of instability, whether it's corruption or malign influence from Russia, are dealt with firmly and swiftly. We believe that continues to be the interests of the United States, to continue helping the region advance towards integration with the rest of Europe, to stronger institutions, to closer partnerships with the United States, helping us in areas such as fighting terrorism, dealing effectively with mass migration flows, and also reinforcing operations or exercises by NATO. So I think the consistency in our policy is based on the consistency of American interests in the region.
Because I'm, concerned, because, our president has said different things about NATO. Once it was irrelevant, maybe it's relevant again. Different things about the EU. And when I talk to some of our allies, they're confused also. And that's why and our president has said he knows more than any of our State Department, our intelligence folks, or anything of that nature, and that he was going to review and change everything, because even though 2 or 3 past administrations, Democratic and Republican, he says they all were wrong, that no one is smarter than he. And so I want to be sure that we're staying on the same path, and there's not been any indication or any order to change the direction, because I think the region is interested in wanting to be secure as what the United States is doing, because too many places folks don't know. And you're telling us that they're going to stay the course. All right. I think we're going to do another round, right? I can give this
if you'd like. Mr. Cicilline.
Thank you, Secretary Yee. I want to just follow up on Mr. Meeks' last set of questions. Have you had discussions with Secretary Tillerson directly about the administration's strategy toward the Balkans? And can you share with us, if you have, how our thinking about the Balkans relates to our strategy in the larger region?
Thank you, sir, for that question. I have not discussed directly with Secretary Tillerson our strategy in the Balkans. However, I can assure you that much of what I ever described in my testimony has been thoroughly circulated and vetted, reviewed by the senior levels of the State Department. And we have, of course, kept Secretary Tillerson informed of our activities, of our plans, and particularly since the Secretary has participated in meetings with NATO allies, that he had to decide whether to sign or not to sign the protocols of accession of Montenegro for NATO membership, and also to advise the President that he is well aware of the importance of the region. And I believe as we have more time, we will be able to.
Okay. I understand that. I just want to be sure that it would be helpful to know if the Secretary of State has actually discussed directly with you the administration's strategy about this area in the region. I take it the answer is no. The second thing I just want to follow up on Mr. Rohrbacher's question. The reference to the Soros Foundation was actually made on our trip as well, and of course it turns out it's a very modest participation, and it's through a competitive grant process. And I want to just ask you whether or not there is any difference in your mind in the work that is supported by the Soros Foundation and the National Endowment for Democracy or the International Republican Institute, those agencies that are doing work on governance, judicial reform, rule of law, strengthening civil society. Is there any difference?
Is there any, sorry, sir, is there any difference between the approach before and the last administration?
No, the work that's being done by the Soros Foundation in those areas, aren't those the same kinds of things that are happening with the National Endowment for Democracy and the the Republican Institute?
Yes, thank you for that question. Yes, absolutely. The type of work that we support, U.S. government supports or European Union, is supported through implementing partners, which are selected according to open and transparent criteria, which include a wide range of organizations, including those that you mentioned, sir. The Soros Institute, Open Society Institute, actually makes up a very small percentage of the assistance programs that are supported by the U.S. government and also by the European Union, as far as I know. The types of criteria that the non-governmental organizations, including Open Society, need to meet are consistent across the board throughout the Balkans.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. And also, would you just tell us a little bit about what your assessment is? There have been proposals of very substantial cuts to foreign assistance to the Balkans and how that might impact the U.S.-Balkan relationships and what are the both short-term and long-term national security interests of the United States. If the level of cuts that have been proposed by this administration, what the impact would be?
Thank you for the question, sir. The State Department is confident that it will be able to carry out the foreign policy priorities set by this administration within the budget blueprint that has been put forward by the administration.
With a 37% cut in foreign assistance?
We will, as always, sir, make the absolute best.
Well, I guess the question isn't will you make the best. Will it have an adverse impact on the work we're doing in the region, the partnerships that we are building with these governments to promote transparency, rule of law, judicial reform, good governance, and to combat the growth of extremism? Because if it's not having any impact on it, we maybe shouldn't spend any money there. I mean, that's clearly not the case. So are you saying that a proposed reduction of 37% will not have an adverse impact on the work we are doing and the long-term national security interests of the United States?
Well, sir, I'll make 2 points on that. First, of course, there's an impact. If we spend less or we spend more, there is an impact because our implementation of programs based on U.S. assistance, we do believe has an impact. So there will be. But
and it will be a negative impact. Well, if there's a nearly 40% cut, that would not advance the national security interests of the United States, in your opinion.
Well, sir, I would say we would have to see what the impact is going to be based on our prioritization and our focus that will be a necessity after we receive the budget from the Congress.
Well, you're not suggesting we're going to have greater influence and be a better partner in the region if we spend 40% less resources devoted to the work.
Well, sir, I'd make this point that U.S. leadership in the impact of American diplomacy is, of course, reliant in great part on our assistance, but it is by no means the only means through which we have an influence on the region. Much of what we're doing today in places like Macedonia and Albania are not dependent on the amount of dollars that we put into our programs. Though again, we of course consider these programs to be very helpful. What is important is that these countries, the populations, the citizens, the parties understand that the U.S. is committed, is willing to demonstrate the leadership necessary in order to help them solve problems, some of which of course do require resources, but some require leadership and a willingness to stand up to authoritarian leaders, corrupt leaders, organized crime, narcotics traffickers. Many of these efforts depend on U.S. leadership.
And resources.
And resources.
Okay. I just want to conclude, Mr. Chairman, by welcoming Ambassador Faber, who is here, who had the pleasure of meeting in Albania, and I want to welcome her to the hearing room. And I'll yield back.
At the request of Mr. Meeks, we will have a second round. And let me just ask right off the bat here, are we, what you're describing is, of course, that the United States is deeply involved. When you have a democratic election in countries like this, does that mean that we are trying to superimpose what we believe would be the best government in a democratic process? Are we telling people that their democratic process is important, but here's what you should be doing because that's our opinion? Isn't that what these Soros operations are all about?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for that question. We are absolutely not imposing our will or our preferences for one party or one policy.
But we are interfering, are we not?
I would not.
I wouldn't say that giving money that goes into helping one party organize this group of people or that group of people, even though it's not on election day, that's not interfering with them?
I would say it's not, sir. It's not going, first of all, the assistance does not go to one party or one group of citizens. It's distributed in a way that is nonpartisan, that is supportive of civil society or other sectors of society.
So nonpartisan is an idea that one party believes in a set of ideas, and it just happens to be that we're helping those ideas, promoting those concepts through whatever nonprofits that we have there, that isn't considered helping the party that's advocating exactly those things and hurting the party that's advocating another direction. That seems to be interference. In Macedonia, we have some pictures up here, and I will find out exactly what they're about, but a majority was elected in Macedonia, and the reports that we have are that our ambassador actually encouraged a situation in which the Macedonian government, rather than having it the majority, the party that won the majority take over, we have been encouraging obstructionism and some kind of coalitions that to try to make sure that the party that won didn't actually take power. Is that an accurate assessment?
Mr. Chairman, thank you for the question. No, it's not an accurate description.
Okay.
Actually, quite the opposite took place. Let me begin with the first part, just to make clear on interference. There's no question that the United States is assertive in defending U.S. interests and what we believe should be accepted by countries that want to be partners with us. And this is important to mention that Macedonia wants to join NATO. Macedonia wants to join the European Union. And the same with Albania also wants to join the European Union. We as partners are trying to help them meet the standards necessary in order to achieve that goal. So when, for example, we advocate for rule of law, when we advocate for judicial independence, when we advocate for human rights, it is not always popular to the government in power. But we believe as partners and as potential allies, it's important to make clear and to help them implement reforms that will advance what we believe is a shared interest. But if the government does not want to support rule of law, does not want to support human rights, it is their sovereign right to do so. It is still our obligation to make clear what our priorities are.
As long as the government is representative of an election process, that they are the real government, whoever.
Absolutely.
We believe the majority of people will decide who is the government. And if we are there undermining that for whatever reason we want the government to go the opposite direction, we are interfering with people's right to choose their government. And we've heard Mr. Meeks is very concerned about any influence the Russians might have. Okay, they have their national interest, we have our national interest, but perhaps it's better for us. I mean, what the result that I see in Macedonia is that, and I use some not totally accurate words when someone asked me about it. They got quoted all over the world, but they don't have, and I should have said a country, they don't have a government. I mean, they don't have a government because there's been people there from the outside, I believe, who's convincing people not to either respect the majority or, number two, not to make the compromises that are necessary for democratic government to work. And if we're down there watching out for our interests, and we have decided that that's tied to social goals that may or may not be what the people there believe in, we are interfering with their with that system to the point that it's totally broken down. And you don't have, correct me if I'm wrong, the government right now, they still have not have a functioning government in Macedonia. Am I wrong?
There is an interim government, sir, to answer your question.
An interim government, right?
Yes.
Okay.
But to answer your question, in Macedonia, the elections did result in a situation in which no one party had a majority. And therefore, it was incumbent upon the parties to form a coalition that would have a majority of seats in parliament so the government could be formed.
Was it a majority of the vote or a majority of the people elected in the parliament?
Or the seats.
It was proportional,
Did-
so
did-
it was essentially the same, that the party,
So no party won a majority of the
no
vote?
party won a majority. However, there was a coalition of members of parliament that did represent a majority that is supposed to receive, under normal European democratic norms, a mandate from the president of the country to form a government. And up until today, the president has been withholding that mandate from the majority. And we have been advocating very strongly, sir, for the president to observe the Constitution, observe European democratic norms, along with our European partners.
Okay, so we have been suggesting that the president send that letter and make that recognition. Is that it?
That he allow the formation of a government, not one party or the other, but to give the mandate to the majority. This is the basic democratic principle. And today he did that. So we've advanced beyond the next step out of this crisis.
It seems to me that this has been going on for a while now, and it's only a little country, and we do have, as you say, a lot of influence in that part of the world, and quite frankly, I think that we've screwed it up, and I'll leave it with that. Mr. Meeks?
Well, I just say, you know, we always talk about the United States being a leader and try to protect and make sure that there's human rights. So we're not trying to force a government to do something, but I think that if we see where human rights violations are wrong, we should challenge the countries on their human rights. When we see there's not freedom of the press, we should challenge the government on whether or not there's freedom of the press. When we see that there is corruption, we should challenge the government on those corrupt issues and not just look away and say that's the will of the people, because clearly when you have certain leaders, the will of the people is not heard because it's the will of the leader, and they prevent the people when you suppress freedom of the press, when you suppress humanitarian rights, when you use certain tactics. And I think that still is a very good role for the United States of America to play. Fact of the matter is, we talk about Russian influence, you know, I want to challenge them. I think that the President of the United States, when he had the foreign minister in the White House, as opposed to talking about secrets that we had, he should have been questioning Russia on human rights, on freedom of the press, on various things. If we shouldn't want to be like them, I think that we set the standard, and we should be the ones that are moving forward in that regards. And let me, a couple of quick questions. You said in your testimony that of secessionist rhetoric in Bosnia, you said it was being leveraged by the Kremlin. How so?
Thank you, Mr. Meeks, for that question. In In Bosnia-Herzegovina, particularly in the Republic of Srpska, there is a strong interest and efforts by Russia to maintain and increase its influence with the government of the Republic of Srpska, both through financial means and also political means. Where we have seen the malign influence in Russia in particular has been in encouraging words of encouragement, what we're aware of in public at least, and we can only imagine in private, encouragement by the Russian Federation of the secessionist plans and movement by certain politicians to break away from Bosnia-Herzegovina, which would be in violation of the Dayton Accords, which we believe to be tremendously destabilizing and would undo many years of hard work in stabilizing Bosnia-Herzegovina and bringing it towards the European Union, and if it decides to NATO as well. So our efforts in Republic of Srpska and Bosnia in general are to strengthen institutions which will make it more difficult for Russia or other external factors who wish to maintain a malign influence, including by strengthening rule of law, by strengthening the free media and strengthening the judiciary, independence of the judiciary, so they're not able.
Let me ask another question, and I don't know, maybe they're doing good things, maybe they're checking human rights, et cetera, but back in 2012, the Russians and the Serbian governments established the Russian-Serbian Humanitarian Center, I think it was in Nice. The and that was founded in order to provide humanitarian emergency response in Serbia and other Balkan states. How do you assess that arrangement and the activities that are working with the Russian-Serbian Humanitarian Center in Serbia?
Thank you for that question, Mr. Meeks. We believe it's very important to be vigilant in general about all Russian moves in the region, since we've seen recent moves by Russia which are undermining the interests of the countries of the Western Balkans and also of the United States, we believe. Most recently, most dramatically in Montenegro, where the Russian government attempted to undermine the elections and the government itself in Montenegro. It's very important to be vigilant. I think we have some questions about why Russia is trying to set up a humanitarian, quote, humanitarian center in Niš, and why it is seeking special status for this facility. We don't believe the intentions are pure, and so we're advising Serbia to ask the hard questions, to ask Serbia why it needs this facility, why it needs to have a special status, and what it's going to do that it can't already do from Belgrade or from existing facilities.
Let me make one last question. Well, actually, it's a statement, but you might want to answer it. It's, piggybacking off of Mr. Cicilline, because you spent much of your testimony on incentives driving countries in the region toward better behavior. But now, if we have these severe budget cuts, aren't you going to gut the very incentives which could help countries move forward? Because a lot of the incentives, it takes personnel costs money, as well as other things, and you won't be able to maintain with a 40% cut personnel as well as other areas. And so therefore, a lot of the incentives that we have been giving out with a 40% budget cut, where even a general said that if you cut the State Department, we're going to just spend the same money in bullets. But isn't that contrary? Wouldn't we be losing out on those incentives to move forward?
Thank you, Mr. Ranking Member. There's no doubt, as Mr. Cicilline also made clear, that the resources that are used in providing assistance to countries of the Western Balkans is important and has had a positive impact. And whether we spend more or less, there will be an impact. The point I want to make in terms of the incentives for the region are that the assistance, in terms of the financial assistance in particular, are not the most important drivers. The most important drivers are the types of reforms these countries need to make, the help, political help, especially these countries need to make these reforms. So, for example, a lot of the countries in the region actually are led by people who do not want to see the country join the European Union or to move forward, because they're invested in the status quo, invested in systems that allow them to exploit state-run enterprises, to maintain control over all of the instruments of power in their countries. So it is somewhat of a paradoxical situation in which we are trying to convince the governments which tell us that they want to join the European Union, that they need to make substantial changes in their political system, in the way of doing business. And these, of course, these processes, these reforms are assisted by our programs. But the most vital element is the political will necessary by the leaders in these countries to move forward to make these changes.
I'm out of time, and I just want to thank you again for your service. I always think that those who work for the State Department are underappreciated. I think that this budget proposal to the State Department shows that underappreciation. I think that I know, you've got to stand there and take the weight here, but it's not gone unnoticed about the service that the men and women of the State Department do on an everyday basis. When we travel and we go and we see what's happening on the ground, and we see how you serve our country, I salute every person that's in the military, but I also salute every person that's in the State Department, because I see members of the State Department putting their lives on the line. And just as we need to increase, and they're looking at ways to increase the defense budget to some degree, we need to make sure that we do the same thing with our State Department, at the very least maintain it, because your job and your work is something that is of tremendous service to the United States of America, and I thank you for it.